Welcome to the Story A Day podcast. This is Julie Duffy from StADa288.org, encouraging you to be a writer every day, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Julie from Story A Day here, and today I want to respond to an opinion piece that I read that came out in the Washington Post yesterday. It was by Kathleen Parker. It is called "Limiting What Novelists Can Write About Won't Help Readers." The reason I want to talk about this is because I didn't look at the picture of the writer till after I'd read it, but when I did, I was not shocked to find it had been written by a blonde white woman. She is not entirely wrong in everything she says in the opinion piece, and obviously it's an opinion piece and people's opinions are their opinions. I don't disagree with everything that she said in her opinion piece on a factual level, but I do think that she almost entirely missed the point about the diverse voices movement, about the movement to include more people. So here's my summary of what she said. In fact, we'll start by quoting her. She quotes the late, great Pat Conroy, who said, "Fiction is where I go to tell the truth." And then she says, "Luckily for him and his readers, Conroy's death in 2016 meant he was spared the pre-publication censorship that fiction writers face today." Now, I will acknowledge that a lot of us who are nominally from the majority culture, i.e. white writers, middle class writers, anyone who, basically looks like me, we are noticing that it is no longer socially acceptable for us to take other people's stories and tell them. And the reason for that is not because we don't have good imaginations. It's not because we can't imagine what it might be like to be from a different culture. Truthfully, we probably can't. You just don't know all of the nuances of being from another culture when you're not from that. And take it from me, as someone who walked from culture to culture throughout my life, you can't know what it's like to grow up deeply embedded in a different culture. It takes a long time to find your way in. And you're constantly noticing ways where you're not noticing things that people from that culture would notice. So that's point one. Point one is I would way rather read a book about black church ladies written by Disha Philyaw than I would a beautifully written book about black church ladies by Margaret Atwood, who probably would have done lots of research and write beautifully about it. And maybe I would want to read both. But this use of the word pre-publication censorship that fiction writers face today has some resonance, because people like me have had to face this. Yeah, should I be writing this story? And that's an uncomfortable question. I've had to wrestle with it. I'm sure you've had to wrestle with it. And I don't think this opinion writer has wrestled with it. I think she's still in the knee-jerk, you can't tell me what to write phase. And I feel no rancor towards her about that, except that she's got this large pulpit from which to spread an opinion which is not nuanced and unhelpful. To say that limiting what novelists can write about won't help readers isn't what she's actually talking about. She uses words like pre-publication censorship. She uses why invite the wrath of the overly sensitive. She says things like the growing imperative to mitigate negative feelings by shielding people from unpleasant truths. Now, you can hear from my voice how I feel about that. That's not what the diverse voices movement is about, and it's not what those of us who are trying to be sensitive and ask, why would good people, intelligent people, make such a fuss about this for so long if it was just some petty vendetta against the people who've always had the privilege? It's not about that. She asks later in the article, Could William Styron publish today when he wrote in the voices of women, Jews, African Americans and plantation owners? How could he know their hearts and minds? The way writers always have, by employing their fertile imaginations, mining their own experiences, and she goes on about that. And fine, that's what we do as writers. Could William Styron have been published today? Sure. But should he have been published at the expense of women writers, Jewish writers, black writers? Should his voice have been elevated? How many writers who weren't white men could have written and been published if the publishing industry had seen them, and if the reading public had been looking for them and asking for them? I think part of the solution here is for us, and this is where I disagree with the headline of her piece entirely, for us to read diverse books, because that does not harm readers. If limiting what novelists can write about won't help readers, for one thing, nobody's limiting what you can write about. You can write about whatever you want. You can write black characters if you're white characters, if you're black, Asian characters, if you're from somewhere completely different. You can write whatever you want. The market at the moment is doing a correction. It's saying people don't really want to read books by white guys about black women. They'd rather hear about black women from black women, because that's more interesting. It's closer to the truth. It gives us the ability to see other worlds and other lives, which is what readers love, in a more authentic way. It gets us closer to truth. Later in the article, Kathleen complains about what's a writer to do, and she complains about one of the person that she interviewed for the opinion piece. This white woman wanted to write a story about a black character, and so she paired up with a black author, and the black author said, "I love that idea, let's do it." And great, it seems like that would be a positive point. If I was writing this opinion piece, that would be a good thing. Not so for this author, because then she leaps from there to, "I envision a novel with 6 authors of diverse backgrounds and a book cover bearing a seal of approval from an artificial intelligence sensitivity reader." Now, it's an opinion piece. She's being outrageous. I get it. But it is easy for people to make that leap, when instead you could say, you know what, if I want to write a book that includes people who I'm not confident I have the ability to represent, maybe I'll get a co-author, or maybe I'll get someone to read it for me, or maybe I'll do a ton of research and run every passage that includes those kinds of characters by someone of that character. Now, because in the diversity movement that has become known as a sensitivity reader, some people lose their minds about that. But in book writing and fiction writing in general, that's just been called research, right? You want to write a book about a surgeon? You talk to a surgeon. You ask the surgeon to read all of the passages that contain a surgeon to see where you're messing up. If you want to write about an astronaut, you go and interview an astronaut who's actually done a spacewalk before you write about the spacewalk. This is just what writers do as well. Nobody is saying you can't write a half-assed surgery scene. They're just saying you're not going to get published and people aren't going to like your book. People are going to make fun of you if you do it badly. She cites the example of Janine Cummins' book, American Dirt, which came out in 2020. Now, another thing that annoyed me about this opinion piece was that the author said, most writers and agents agree that this America's new literary dark age began with this book, American Dirt, which got a lot of backlash because, and she acknowledges, some Mexican Americans slammed the book for containing stereotypes. Okay. So backlash, literary dark age, because the people that you were writing about thought that your writing was a bit stereotyped. And then, of course, once the internet got hold of it, everyone looked into it, and the writer has some Latina credit, but not very much. She wasn't enough, so that's a whole other debate. But the thing that annoyed me was that this opinion writer, who I feel like is just in this knee-jerk, I'm afraid I'm not going to be allowed to write what I want phase, instead of the, let me think about why this might actually be a good thing, or how I can be a responsible citizen phase. She says that this started in 2020. Now, this discussion has been going on for a long time. The science fiction and fantasy world, which I tend to pay a lot of attention to, had its own sort of nuclear moment with this in 2013, when a group called the Sad Puppies started complaining about all the science fiction and fantasy books that were not military sci-fi, but being written by people of colour and women and gay people, and that didn't involve fighting robots. And they actually went so far as to disrupt the Hugo Awards to try and pad ballots against books that actually had storylines and issues that couldn't have been or weren't published in the 1950s. And 7 years before she noticed this issue, this has been roiling in the science fiction and fantasy world. This blew apart the Romance Writers of America before Janine Cummins' book was even released. It's intellectually lazy, and it's knee-jerk fear-mongering irritated the hell out of me because of the inaccuracies in here. So, when she cites authors who wouldn't be allowed to write now, she talks about Pat Conroy and William Styron and Mark Twain, and Harper Lee's in there. She's at least female. Is she reading these diverse books that are coming out? Is she reading Cherie Renee Thomas? Is she reading Bernardine Evaristo? Is it a bad thing that we get wider perspective? If you go to corporate America, a place not known for its sentimentality, you can find study after study that shows that increasing the diversity of your workplace is good for the bottom line. There's a stat from Forbes that says that diverse workplaces are 70% more likely to be in more markets, because different people notice different things. They notice different needs. They notice different audiences. They appeal to different audiences in different ways. And this is true of writing. If the publishing industry is focused right now on inclusivity, which I think it's kind of getting there a little bit, and I bet if you talk to writers of colour, disabled writers, trans writers, they're not particularly feeling like the publishing industry is beating a path to their door and begging them for their work. We're just seeing some more books by people of colour, disabled writers, trans writers. And it's noticeable because they're unusual. And that's not entirely something we should be patting ourselves on the back about. But if we take that lesson from corporate America, that you're 70% more likely to be in more markets, your bottom line is going to go up, you're going to have more creativity, more innovation when you diversify your workforce. What happens to the stolid and stodgy and frankly not very businesslike publishing industry if we get more diverse people into publishing? And if it starts with the people who are already there looking for diverse voices, then the people who are coming in as authors may agitate for more people like them to be in the business of publishing, and that's going to be good for the business of publishing. If readers have access to diverse voices, not only are white people going to be better about understanding people who don't look like them, there's a huge untapped market of people who are hungry for stories about people who are a bit more like them, or about who feel a bit more authentic to them. If all those people start buying books and the publishers start making more money and the indie bookstores start coming back, how is that bad for readers? How is that bad for writers? Yes, it's a scary moment to be a person who looks like me, middle-aged white woman. It's not going to make it easier for me to get published and make a living if I am not what the publishing industry is looking for. But there are trends. And if the publishing industry expands and can offer more contracts to more writers, and in the meantime, I've been working on writing closer to the truth, better scenes, better characters, keeping my production high and not worrying about who else is getting published and what people want to hear or not hear, then when the time is right, maybe I stand a chance. For all writers, I think, you don't want to censor yourself. But if you want to be a commercial writer, you do have to pay attention to what the market wants. And the market doesn't really want white people writing about people of colour, able-bodied people writing about disabled people, straight people writing about gay people. Not really. It's not that you can't write this stuff. You can write this stuff. And you can write brilliantly. And there will be readers who enjoy your stuff. It's not what the market's looking for right now. Of course, a backlash on Twitter is unpleasant. But that's the extremes. We've got a moment in time where there are extreme voices everywhere who want to bash everyone for everything. And we can't let that stop us from writing our truths and our stories. And if you want to write stories about people who are radically different from you, that's awesome. Do your research. Do some research. Talk to people. Read books by writers of colour. Read literary theory books by teachers of colour. Another inaccuracy in this article which bugged me was this idea of literary criticism requires, and I quote, among other things, consideration of an author's historical time and cultural context. No, it doesn't. One school of literary theory does. Another school of literary theory requires that you ignore all those things and concentrate purely on the text. It's probably fallen out of fashion now, but I learned about it. It's out there. It exists. There are different schools of literary theory and literary criticism. Read what's going on in the diversity community. I don't know if that's the right term, but there's lots of literary analysis and criticism going on right now which talks about how to manage and handle all of these issues. There are people like Matthew Salisis pointing out that if you are a person of colour, the way you walk through the world is different. The way that the things that you notice at a stoplight in a city will be different from the things that a suburban white woman notices at a stoplight in this city. The way you act when a police officer pulls you over is different from the way someone from another community will react when a police officer pulls them over, for reasons. The reason I think I feel so strongly about this is because I grew up as a Scottish girl in the south of England, where there's a very strong bias against anyone who wasn't like them. And I didn't talk like this then, I talked like them, but they knew I was Scottish, I was a redhead, and my family was from Scotland, and people just know stuff like that about you. And so I had to deal with, when I was little, kids saying, oh, you're Scottish, you eat porridge for breakfast and you eat haggis, and none of these things were true, which was enraging. And it's tiny stuff like that, that when people of colour in the US started talking about, I started hearing them talk about microaggressions, I instantly understood what they were talking about, because it's stuff like that you can't really complain about because it's not really anything in itself, but that everyday othering of you adds up. Knowing that you have to arm yourself to be ready to take the joke, which isn't a funny joke, it's just someone telling you you're not like me. That's exhausting, and it changes you. So I had a lot of sympathy for it when I heard it coming out in the US from a more racial point of view, because I had experienced it just being an outsider in my own country. And then when I moved back to Scotland, there were all kinds of other issues going on with that. And then when I moved to the US, everybody told me, it was right when Outlander came out, and everybody was like, oh, you should read Outlander. And I'm like, yeah. I just came from there. And also, why would I want to read a book written by a Texan woman about men in kilts? And they're fine books, they're good books. And I love the fact that she has now gone on and educated a ton of people about the history of Scotland and the politics and all that. It's all great stuff. But that's a woman from Texas writing about Scotland. How many Scottish authors do you read? How many Scottish authors have you heard of? You may have heard of some. Did she take up shelf space that could have been given to a Scottish author? Yes. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. Because the Scottish tourism industry is booming because of Outlander. Yay. But then I walk into a bookstore and I see a rack of romances with covers on them, men in kilts, bare-chested, in front of a rugged, mossy, mountainous background. And somehow that's supposed to represent Scotland. And that's what people think of when they hear my accent. Is that, which is not representative of Scotland in any way, shape or form. Yes, sometimes men wear kilts, but very rarely with a bare chest, because it is not a warm country. And they would not look like that. And I know it's fantasy, but again, it comes back to when you perpetuate a stereotype that is wrong, people who are from that cultural group have to deal with that. They have to explain that men don't walk around with their shirts off in Scotland very often. And they have to explain that not everybody drinks whiskey, and that I've never been to a Highland Games and I don't play the bagpipes, and all these things that you know about Scotland are wrong. Whereas if you've read Trainspotting by Irving Welsh, or if you read Ian Rankin's Rebus novels, or if you read Denise Mina, you know that life in modern Scotland is nothing like the fantasy life. But if you haven't read those authors and you don't see those authors, how are you going to know that? If I hadn't read Deisha Philya's Secret Life of Church Ladies, which is fiction, is not true, I would know less about what it's like to be a woman in that kind of community. If I hadn't read James McBride's Deacon King Kong, I would have much more of an outsider's view of what it's like to live in a project on the edge of New York City in the 1970s. Was it the 60s? I feel like I have friends in other cultures now because my literary friends from other cultures are there. So when we're worrying about this, when we're worrying about what are we allowed to write, you're allowed to write everything. You're allowed to write anything. And if the market doesn't want it right now, you have a choice to make. You can fix your working method to fit the trend. You can ask yourself, why is what I'm writing not commercial? You can ask yourself, do the people who are complaining about the way things have always been have a really good reason for complaining about it? Could I be wrong in my entrenched opinions? Writers are great at being curious, having imaginations. You shouldn't let worries about any of this stuff stop you writing, because if you are worried about it, you're probably going to do the things I'm talking about. And if you want to write a story about a black historical character, maybe you do want to team up with a great black writer. Or get a sensitivity reader, or call them an editor, whatever you want to do. But I don't think whining about it, because things are changing, is the way to go. And I don't think saying that limiting what novelists can write about is accurate or helpful. And I don't think that expanding the pool of writers who are writing about the world from their experience is ever not going to help readers. I think Kathleen Parker is wrong about almost everything she says in this opinion piece on a factual level. I can't say her opinions are wrong because they're her opinions. I just hope that those of us who are writing fiction aren't held back by fears about this swirling cultural moment. Write whatever you want. And if you want to be commercially published, consider what the market is looking for. And if it's not what you're writing, don't get angry. Ask yourself whether you want to change what you're writing to fit the market, whether you want to find a smaller, different market, or whether you just want to write for your own pleasure. To say the pendulum has swung too far is to listen to the extremists who are getting in a tizzy about things. To say the pendulum has swung too far is probably to out yourself as a member of the majority culture. There are hard-working people in the publishing industry trying to get this right. And there are hard-working writers with sensitive souls who are trying to get this right. And mocking people for taking account of the generational trauma of another group, of all the other groups, is disappointing, unhelpful, and invites more people to be intellectually lazy. That's my opinion. Keep writing. Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at StADa288.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week, and of course, keep writing.